How would you describe imposter syndrome or the imposter phenomenon?
Imposter syndrome is when someone fears that or feels that they're a fraud despite evidence of their success. Statistically about 70% of people are challenged with this at time in their life, and it's often associated with high achievers, overachievers, and those who put high expectations on themselves. I guess an example of that would be running a race and everyone else sees you as the winner, but you've come across the finish line thinking you've cheated somehow. Maybe you had better shoes or the other people weren't as well. There's some other external factor that's made you think that you're a fraud and that you shouldn't have won the race.
What are some of the common feelings or traits someone with imposter syndrome would experience?
So common factors are they feel like they're being a fraud, and they attribute it to other factors, like external factors.
Where do you think the most common places are where people experience the feelings of imposter syndrome?
Workplaces definitely, because of the competition and pressure for high success. Academic settings, because students often feel there's a lot of comparison and competition for success. Social media also puts a lot of pressure on people because of, reels put pressure on people for comparison and success, and also underrepresented groups as well. So women or minority groups that are working in a role, or those that are working in a role where there might only be one woman working amongst a whole lot of men, and they may feel their imposter syndrome might be triggered in those sort of situations.
Why do you think imposter syndrome is so prevalent in today's workplace?
Probably the major thing that doesn't get talked about is the openness to discuss success and failure in the workplace. It's really important that people get a chance to really be open about what they're feeling, and that not everything is a success. And as we mentioned earlier, social media has put a lot of pressure on people that everything's a success, everything you do must be wonderful.
What are some things that people can do to alleviate these feelings?
The major thing with dealing with imposter syndrome is shifting the mindset. So that often relies on, with the counsellor, helping you to create new tools so that you can shift unhelpful thinking to reframe it. Some other things you can do is journaling. Some people love journaling, some people don't. What I often suggest is keeping a wins list. So you actually outline every time you do something that is a success. So you can just quickly look back on that, and when you're feeling like you're a fraud and you're about to be found out, you just flip back through that journal and think, oh, I did this and this was a success and I did that well. And that's a way of reframing your thinking.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. The term fake it till you make it, I've experienced that myself, but I don't always know if that's the best advice that you can give yourself. What are your thoughts on that?
I am not a fan of fake it until you make it. That might be because in working in corporate, I often found that the people who faked it until they made it were often those without the talent.
Yes.
And they often got the job over someone who did have the talent, but they didn't have the charisma and the charm. I think a better way to phrase it is face it until you make it.
I like that. If people are experiencing anxiety at work, how can they tell if it's imposter syndrome or something like performance anxiety in a small amount that could potentially be helpful?
The tells, whether it's imposter syndrome or whether it's anxiety, if it's anxiety coming up to a presentation, it's task focused. It's related to that presentation or it's related to that report, and it's short-lived. Whereas imposter syndrome is constant. It is always there, it is always in the background, and it's that little voice talking away in there, and it just doesn't go away.
Can imposter syndrome ever be present in a relationship? And what would that look like?
Imposter syndrome does exist in relationships, and it takes a little bit of a different form than what you might see it in a corporate setting or in an academic setting. And it's usually the tells are that the person is compromising, and they're always saying, yes, I'll do that, and they're not setting boundaries, and they're not saying, well, look, that doesn't work for me, because they fear that they're not good enough, and that if they do, their partner will leave them. So it sets up an imbalance, and that's where a counsellor can really help with that imbalance, to put back a little bit of self-confidence and a little bit of self-esteem, and set some healthy boundaries so that it actually strengthens the relationship, because otherwise it becomes a little bit weighted.
And they may even be able to draw their attention to it in the first place if they're not aware of it as a couple.
Yes, absolutely.
How can imposter syndrome hold talented people back in their careers?
It does it in several ways. First of all, it stops them putting themselves forward for a promotion. It often, you find them overworking to prove themselves, like, I'm not good enough, I've got to stay back late. And what happens is they burn out. They burn out a lot quicker than other people, or they avoid situations. They avoid public speaking, they avoid an opportunity to stand up and present their idea. And in many corporate situations, what happens is the person with imposter syndrome is immediately targeted by someone who go, oh, well, I'll stand up and present your idea. And then suddenly someone else has owned their idea, and they're feeling a little resentful or and not valued, because they're not being seen for contributing these fabulous ideas, simply because the imposter syndrome is holding them back.
Yeah. How can counselling help someone with imposter syndrome?
Counselling for someone with imposter syndrome, it sets a safe space where they can really talk about those fears of being a fraud, and they can be open. And depending on the situation and the person, the counsellor might use some cognitive behavioural therapy. So they're actually changing or helping them change the unhelpful thinking to something a little more positive, so reframing. So the reframing might be, I'm not good enough to, I'm learning and I'm progressing like everyone else is in this job, because it might be a new role.
Are there any circumstances where imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon could be helpful?
It can be helpful in small doses. So an example of that might be, it helps someone become a little bit more diligent in preparing for a presentation or something like that. But it's got to be kept in check and in balance. And in most times the little voice is unhelpful, and thus coming into counselling again is where you can develop some great tools to refocus the thinking, reframe the thinking, so that you can develop resilience and confidence in the workplace.
What advice would you give someone who's watching this, who's hesitant to seek counselling for imposter syndrome?
I guess the great way to look at it is that counselling for imposter syndrome is really an investment in your future, because you're sitting there and you're able to openly talk about what it is that you feel that you're a fraud for, and it's in a safe environment. But more so, the counsellor is going to help you develop some tools. I guess the way to look at it is, it's like uploading a new app to your brain, because we don't come with all these tools on how to deal with certain situations, depending on our background and how we've been reared as children. That all relates to, it feeds into imposter syndrome. So a counsellor is going to help you with any unhelpful thoughts. It's going to help you reframe and really give you the resilience and the confidence to step forward in any situation or cope with any situation in a work situation. So again, like we said earlier, it's about facing it until you make it as such. So it really is an investment in you and in the future.